from Scott in the system. And today, our guest is Liz Keegan from Fair Housing of Western Michigan. Hello, and thank you for coming today.
And thank you so much for having me, Scott.
How did you get involved with Fair Housing in West Michigan?
That is a great question. I was actually working at a local college on racial justice and community leadership issues. It was a bit of a startup program, and the Fair Housing Center contacted my director looking for help with event planning, which is actually something that I was doing under my job at the college. And so I was connected on a contract basis back in 2001, essentially planning the annual Fair Housing event, which we typically host in the spring. April is Fair Housing Month, so I don't know if a lot of people know that. But I started with event planning for about 5 years. And in 2006, I went full-time. I'm the first director of education and outreach at the Fair Housing Center. There's now 2 people working on education and outreach at the Fair Housing Center, which is super growth for me. And I'm very excited to have staff person Brianna Miranda helping me do education on fair housing. It's so important to share the message of fair housing. So I'm thankful to be on the show and reach your viewers and listeners. And I'm thankful for the opportunity.
I don't know how many there are per se, but hopefully there's more than 1 or 2.
I'm sure there are.
Okay. For our next question here, if I can exit, there we go. What is the fair housing exactly?
That's a great question. Essentially, we investigate illegal housing discrimination under federal, state, and local fair housing laws that are based on protected classes that can change. The list can grow or shrink based on where you live or where you want to live. So we are really looking at how can we help people rent, buy, get a home loan, even get homeowners insurance free from discrimination based on things like your race, your religion, your national origin, your skin color is protected, your age is protected, your gender is protected, whether or not you're married here in Michigan is a protected class. So there's a whole list of protections that the law says these are people that need to be treated equally, specific to accessing housing. So our job is to provide that information under the Fair Housing Center mission. The challenge is, and I think you're very well aware of this, Scott, right now the housing market feels very unfair. So the name Fair Housing Center, I think, can confuse people. If it's not a civil rights law issue, we can't really help. You know, we can't find housing for people. We don't develop or offer housing ourselves. Our job is really to only focus on making sure people don't get discriminated against and are treated equally when they're looking to access housing.
Could you follow up on that statement you made about the current market situation?
Yes. So even before the pandemic started, there was not a lot of available, affordable, quality housing in West Michigan. What was happening was that a lot of rental communities had wait lists, especially for housing that meets a very specialized need. Housing for older adults, housing for people with disabilities, that's been in high demand for a long time. So people sometimes have to wait to be able to access openings and get on wait lists. The other side of that is the sales market was booming before the pandemic, and it actually really hasn't slowed down. We were seeing homes selling in 24 hours or less. So whether you're looking to rent or buy, before the pandemic, it was very challenging. And then of course the pandemic began, and people were ordered to stay close to home or stay at home if they were able to. And for those who had housing, that worked out okay. But for people who were precariously housed or in the process of moving, I think people's understanding of the importance of where you live was really amplified, of course, by what's been happening with the pandemic. So the housing market can feel very unfair. I talked to one real estate agent recently, and she was representing a home for sale in the Kentwood area, and just a very standard, lovely 3-bedroom home. I think she said she got over 60 offers to buy that house in the first day that it was listed. That's really, really competitive, you know, so one person wins out and 59 other people are still looking for housing. So that kind of competition makes it very hard to discover if illegal discrimination is actually occurring unless something is directly said. There's 2 types of discrimination generally. There's overt discrimination where the person is told something about you doesn't fit here. You know, if a person of color is told, we don't have a lot of residents like you, or a person with a disability is told, we're not really set up to house someone like you, that's pretty clearly being pointed out to them that you're different and you're getting different treatment and you're not welcome here, right? So that's overt, kind of in your face type discrimination. There's also something that we call polite discrimination or covert discrimination. And it's maybe withdrawing an open housing opportunity after seeing someone in person, not really saying anything, but just, oh, shoot, this apartment just rented. And maybe it actually didn't just rent. So it's those difficulties of uncovering what's actually going on here that our fantastic enforcement and advocacy team are tasked with doing, is discovering, is what's happening really equal treatment, or are there hidden barriers to accessing housing of your choice?
Okay, so when it's a seller's market as it is currently, sometimes it can be convenient to say, oh, let's not, deal with that person because of their disability or otherwise.
That does happen very much so. People have a lot of preferences. People have a lot of attachment to their housing. I think housing is very, very personal. As we've learned in the pandemic, it's literally your refuge, right? And even in the pre-pandemic days, after a tough day out volunteering or out working or doing whatever we're doing, when you get home, you have that moment of, oh, okay, I'm home. You can kind of relax and be yourself and get into your comfortable clothes. And, it's a refuge for us. So it's very, very personal. And I think that's leads some of the behavior that we see where people are very concerned of, do you fit in? Are you comfortable? Or simply they've never known a person with a disability or a person from that country or a person practicing that faith. So maybe there's a little bit of fear of the unknown. There's all kinds of things, I think, that can lead people to have preferences or biases. And the laws were written very clearly from the time that Dr. King was working on what he called open housing, which we now call fair housing in the 1960s. The laws say your biases cannot intervene with the housing choice of others. So we're really fortunate that we have this fantastic set of laws. Michigan actually has an extended set of laws, and the city of Grand Rapids has even more law within their city limits that prohibits discrimination, for example, based on medical condition, genotype, sexual orientation, gender identity. There's a lot of communities that have tried to say this is a safe place to live with equal opportunity. So we have a lot of different laws to evaluate and try to help promote that equal housing choice. It's just very, very challenging when housing is filling up so quickly. And of course, now with the eviction moratorium being withdrawn, I think we'll see a lot of people receiving notice that they need to move, and we're going to see a lot of shuffling. So again, this is a very timely conversation, and I appreciate you highlighting fair housing.
So I would say it's fair to say when it's a buyer's market, that is probably gonna put things more in our favor for the less fortunate, so to speak.
I think there's more opportunity, yes, in a buyer's
Okay.
market for people. You know, when I bought my house for the first time on my own, that was a big learning curve. And even though I work for fair housing, actually buying a home and getting a loan, it's like learning a different language, right? So
Right.
it can be a very challenging process in the best of times. So I've experienced the buyer's market, but I think right now we were solidly in a seller's market. And also just West Michigan is growing. It's attracting a lot of people who want to live here. And that's, you know, I don't think we've kept up with enough housing being developed or maybe infilling our neighborhoods with more housing opportunity to have enough units or homes to hold everyone who would like to live here.
Okay. Before we go to our next question, is there a website our viewers could go to if they're not in the West Michigan area, around the country per se?
Absolutely. So they are welcome to contact us at the Fair Housing Center of West Michigan. We are 616-451-2980. We can look that up for someone, but if they are good on the internet, they can go to the National Fair Housing Alliance. That website is nationalfairhousing.org. And in their about section, they have a map of the entire United States with little bubbles on it that tell you where the fair housing centers are across the country. So hopefully there's a fair housing center close to any of our national viewers that they can look up at nationalfairhousing.org.
Okay, okay. I'll be putting that information after the interview so they can see that.
Excellent. I love that point of advocacy of thinking of others. But as I said, if we're able to answer the phone and do that for you, we're happy to. We
Okay.
really welcome phone calls. As we've talked about it, I think maybe people are understanding this can be very complicated. And we're a nonprofit. We don't give legal advice. We don't have attorneys on staff, but we spend all of our time thinking about fair housing. And we really want to connect people with the right resources. So even if you're calling from a different part of Michigan, we will do our best to send you to the right place. It's our job to listen to figure out what resources you might need and if we can help you. So if anyone has any doubt about whether what they're experiencing is a fair housing issue, please contact us. We can talk through what's going on and help you identify if there's a fair housing issue that we would like to help get addressed.
Okay, that's wonderful.
Mhm.
Uh, what is a reasonable accommodation or uh, modification?
Reasonable accommodations or modifications are available under fair housing laws for persons with disabilities. It's people with physical or mental disabilities that have an impairment that impacts a major life activity. So sleeping, walking, bathing, breathing, driving, eating, hearing, seeing a little bit differently. Those are all considered protected under this big definition of people with disability under fair housing laws. It also protects people who are assumed to be a person with a disability, or even if someone is affiliated with persons with disabilities. This is a big pocket of protection. And a big part of that are these reasonable accommodations and modifications. And before I get into the definition of those, I just want to share with anybody who's listening or watching, this is our number one issue in our complaint base and has been for about 6 years now. Disability-based discrimination has been number one in our caseload in West Michigan since 2016.
Is there any reason why that spiked in the last 5 years?
I wish I had a good answer to that, Scott, but I have some thoughts about it. One is that the protections passed in 1988. So I'm old enough to remember 1988, but that's not that long ago when you think about progress under law. So a lot of communities were built and developed. Housing was already existing. Policy, guidelines, practices for a lot of housing was already in place, well before 1988. So I think a lot of the issues that we see are old issues that have not kept up in time with what the law says. And I think people are also very ignorant of disability rights law. I'll give a couple examples and maybe that'll help explain too that lack of information. A lot of housing professionals who do rental property management don't know about fair housing laws. In fact, this might surprise you, they're not required to take fair housing classes or training in the rental industry. So you legitimately can run across a lot of people on homeowners association boards, condo association boards, people who control access or manage housing, but they don't know what their responsibilities are. So I think there's just a lot of lack of awareness of the law.
You would think that would be a prerequisite.
Yes, lenders have to take fair lending training at banks. Real estate agents have to maintain continuing education credits that include legal and fair housing to keep their real estate licenses. So those professionals are required to have access and ongoing, education on that. But in the rental side, that just doesn't exist. So maybe that's something that will change in time. But in the meantime, we offer, that's part of one half of my job is working with the housing industry. A lot of my classes are rental focused to help people understand. We do see a lot of unintentional discrimination too. A lot of people simply don't know better or they don't know what to do and they kind of freeze up or ignore it and hope it'll go away. And that's not right under fair housing laws, especially for people with disabilities. So back to your original question about accommodations and modifications. I'll start with a modification. It's a physical structural change to a housing unit, maybe to the apartment, but also it could be to the community space, a community room, a mail room, a laundry room on an apartment complex site, anything that needs to be literally changed in order to allow full access for a person with a disability is a modification. So basically, if you can reach out and touch the change, like a grab bar, like a ramp, like a railing, like a different type of doorknob, widening a door frame, for example, to allow for a wheelchair or other adaptive equipment to fit through it, that's a modification. And for the most part, people are allowed to ask for permission to make modifications in their housing if they have a disability as defined under law. So essentially, they're given permission by the apartment complex, let's say, to make those changes. And in private housing, that individual needs to arrange for and pay for those changes. So that's something I think I just had a case where the apartment complex gave permission for work to be done, but the resident didn't know that it was her responsibility and that she would have to pay for the modification. So just a miscommunication, classic lack of awareness right there. So that was a situation where we were able to advocate, get both parties back on the same page, and actually get a partner agency, Disability Advocates of Kent County, involved. They were able to come in with information about the tub cut. They had a really neat handheld shower piece of equipment that was really helpful to our client. And they were able to have grab bars for her too. So she didn't have to pay for everything. She was able to get some of the stuff from one of our partners, but essentially we were able to get the bathroom changed to where she could utilize all of the features in the bathroom and be safe. And more importantly, age in place. She wanted to stay in this apartment for the rest of her life. But her difficulty breathing and the use of oxygen made it very dangerous for her to use the bathroom as it was originally built and designed. So our services are like that are no cost as well. That might be one of your questions, but I want to make sure to say that's something that we can do for our clients at no cost, is do that advocacy. On the accommodation side, that is not a tangible change, but it's a change in rules, policies, procedures, services offered by the housing professional. So that could be asking a real estate agent for large font documents because you have, you see or read things a little bit differently. So if you need it in size 18-point font, you would ask, please accommodate me and do something different from your normal day-to-day business. Maybe normally it's an 11 or 12-point font. That's an example of asking a professional to change what they do. Other types of accommodations are allowing for assistance animals, allowing for an assigned accessible parking space, changing when the rent might be due because of the receipt, the date of receipt of disability income. You know, if your rent is due on the 1st, but your money doesn't arrive until the 8th, that makes it very challenging. And we find a lot of people on disability income paying $25 late fees every month, which adds up very quickly over a 12-month lease.
Oh, definitely.
Right. So we can kind of help advocate. The question is, you know, whatever the change that's being requested is, it must be reasonable. So the best outcome for an accommodation or modification request is that the two parties work together, that it's an interactive process. So maybe it's a landlord and a tenant. Maybe it's a condo association and an owner. One of the very first cases I worked on was helping advocate for a woman with vertigo who owned a condo in a community, but they didn't want her to put in a handrail at her front door. They thought it would look, you know, first it would look different from the other units, and they were concerned that it would look ugly. But she really had trouble. It was one of those like extra tall steps, you know, so just navigating that with nothing to hold on to for her to get to her front door made it very, very unsafe and difficult. And so the result for her was often she would choose not to go out, right? She would stay home.
Mm-hmm.
And that really impacted her emotional and mental health. And also having to kind of fight for this small change, this modification, really was disheartening for her. So we were able to help advocate, educate the board to say, this is what the law says, this is what's allowed. Her son was ready. He had the equipment, he had the cement, he had the post picked out, he was willing to paint it whatever color they wanted. You know, they were really trying to work together. And we just kind of gave that nudge to say, this needs to be allowed. She needs to be able to have this because of her disability. So, you know, it can be as simple as a conversation, a phone call, a letter from the Fair Housing Center, whatever the client wants us to do. Or if it's really not moving forward, we can engage cooperating attorneys. We can help people file complaints with the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, HUD, HUD, or the Michigan Department of Civil Rights, MDCR. They accept fair housing complaints, and they're the ones with enforcement authority. So Liz doesn't really have any enforcement authority other than I can educate and I can talk to people. Sometimes that works, but sometimes we need some enforcement or some authority behind us to get these changes made. So we can work with our clients to really figure out what process fits their needs and let them kind of lead us through what they would like to see happen. But those are definitely, gosh, we had 99 cases of disability-based discrimination in 2020. So in spite of the pandemic, a huge portion of our caseload was about 184 cases total, almost 100 of which were disability related, heavily failure to allow for accommodations in housing.
I don't want to go too far down the rabbit hole, but one of the biggest modifications I worry about if I was fortunate enough to move into a house setting is a roll-in shower.
Yes. Mm-hmm. Yes, those are critical. And really, everybody has their own unique set of needs. And that's the beauty of how fair housing laws were written. I think for housing providers, it can be confusing because it was left very broad, intentionally to be decided on a case-by-case basis. But that way, Scott, you know already what you would want to see. If you needed something like that, you've identified what you would like to have in the bathroom. That's the way it should be. It should be driven by the person who needs these changes. And these laws really allow for that. And we encourage, and the law encourages, that each of these situations be evaluated based on the unique facts, what type of housing, what's possible under local health and safety codes, because you certainly don't want to have something that is put in that's even more dangerous or doesn't solve the problem, right? And really just led by that person who's looking to fully use and fully enjoy their housing. You know, if we rent an apartment in a community, we should be able to use every part that comes with that community. It's something that we're paying for. So typically these happen in rental situations or in places where there's community guidelines, like a condo association or a homeowners association. And we're really happy to advocate to make sure these changes get made in a way that is in compliance with the law, but hopefully really helps that individual fully use and enjoy their property.
Just based on your experience, is something like a roll-in shower a major undertaking, or does it all depend on the situation and the people involved?
It can absolutely, each setting can impact the outcome. You know, if we're talking about a bathroom that has, and I'm not a builder, or I don't do my own renovations. I'm, you know, very minimal in terms of my own handiwork. But you know, if you're taking out a prefabricated tub shower, you know, that's one big plastic piece. If that's what's in there, removing that maybe isn't necessarily difficult. But let's say you're maybe in an older building and it's an iron clawfoot tub, right? And there's no waterproofing around that tub, it's just curtains. Those two projects, I think, would look very different, but it doesn't essentially matter if the roll-in shower is what you need. That outcome is the most important. The law says that those changes need to be done in a workmanlike manner, and then you can have a conversation about what happens to those changes at the end of your lease, for example. But that's basically it. Is it reasonable to allow for that type of switch? And I would say 9 times out of 10, we're going to find yes. The question always is who pays? So that might have been your next question, but like I said, if it's housing that has no federal money, it's not operated by the state or by HUD, if it's in the private housing market, the person who's in that unit is responsible for paying for that type of modification. And that can be very challenging. Not a lot of people have $5,000, $10,000 sitting around.
Oh,
so
come on.
Right?
All disabled people have that. Oh, yeah.
So, you know, that's a barrier, but, you know, there are great community agencies thinking about that and working on it. You know, Home Repair Services, for example, has regular ramp builds that they do in partnership with Disability Advocates of Kent County. So, you know, that's why we want our partners involved to say, who's got a resource for this? Is there a church group with a fund available that would be able to help pay for this installation? Maybe somebody has grab bars, you know, in the closet that they're not using. Can we get those out into the community for somebody who needs them? If you live in federally funded housing, so public housing, commission housing, housing that's operated by the government, every modification essentially is treated like an accommodation, meaning it's the housing provider's responsibility. So in that type of housing, people with disabilities would typically pay a lot less or maybe not pay anything at all for modifications. And so that's why we're here, is to help answer some of those questions. What law applies to this housing? How is it funded? What can we do with our partners to meet the needs of this client based on their unique needs related to their disability? We can do all of that legwork, figure out a plan, and help with the advocacy to get permission for these things to move forward. Now, my team can't come in and do the build. You don't want us to do that sort of work, but we can be the advocates and we can provide the information on the law.
Yes, that's wonderful, because just thinking about it in general can be overwhelming, and you just don't want to even take on the challenge.
Exactly. And we have found clients who have lived with significant barriers for years because they just didn't have the time or the energy, or they didn't want to use their voice because they had a lot of other things going on. This is something that happens repeatedly in some of our cases. As I mentioned, the one woman just stayed home. That happens a lot when people can't get a designated parking space for themselves. They would just park in if they found their open spot that worked best for them, they would park and go in and sometimes stay home for weeks. Now, during the pandemic, we were all ordered to stay home. So I think hopefully the rest of us have a greater understanding of what it means to not have the ability to come and go without thought. People would literally say, I'm going to skip going to church. I'm going to skip going to the grocery store. I don't need that medicine. I don't want to lose my parking spot, because what if I get back and I have to walk all the way around the apartment building? I can't do it. I'm not able to walk safely that distance. So we make these accommodations happen, and our clients sometimes will come back to us and say, my whole life has changed. And it can be very simple to say, what, we're gonna, for assistance animals, we see people getting charged pet fees. One client of ours was paying $50 a month in pet fees for her 2 emotional support animals. So what she was doing was giving up groceries one week, medication the next week, because she was on a very strict budget. So she was putting her need for her emotional support ahead of those other needs, but she shouldn't have ever had to choose. So in that situation, we were able to get some of that money refunded, and she was able to go back on full medication and get her groceries. So these may sound like very small, things, and maybe property managers and condo associations don't think of the impact of some of these decisions, but it can be a very detrimental impact on someone's health if they don't have some of these changes that they need.
Well, yes, if there's one thing we can say we learned during the pandemic, is what it means to be homebound. We're talking about all these modifications or accommodations. How would we make a request?
Absolutely. So somebody only needs to say to their housing provider, whether it's a property manager, a landlord, or a homeowners association board, basically somebody would just say, I have a disability and I need this change. And that should trigger the process. You don't have to use reasonable accommodation, reasonable modification. You can if you want to, you can if you know that language. You are also welcome to call our office or visit our website or send us an email, whichever communication is comfortable for you, and let us know, I need help. We have sample letters we can give to you. We can help somebody write a request letter. We can send, information on the law if we think that would be helpful. We can help craft those requests and provide kind of that education to the person making the request. On the flip side, if you've got any landlords or housing providers listening, they can contact us and say, I got a request for a grab bar. I've never had one before. What do I do? And we would provide information from that perspective to the landlord to help them understand their responsibility. So it's kind of a mix of, these are the rights of the individuals and these are the responsibilities of the housing industry. We will work with both parties because essentially, if they have the same information, we're hoping it'll help the process go smoothly.
Okay. What if there is cost involved?
Yes, that is going to require a little bit of that homework that I've kind of been hinting at. You know, we've got to evaluate how is the property funded. So that determines if the housing provider would pay or if the resident would pay. We would assess, you know, what's available in the community. Are there resources where this could be done by another agency? If not, then, you know, we can kind of help make sure that they're connected to groups that can help them get quotes or drawings or renderings. You know, anything that will help move the process forward, we'll try to point people in the right direction. But the cost question in general, again, if you live in government provided housing, there may be no costs. If you live in private housing, you may be responsible for the costs. But I say that with kind of the understanding that that all needs to be verified or researched, you know, and that's something that we can help with.
Okay. Okay. Far as when it comes to looking for a home as a disabled individual, do you guys have like resources that help those on their path of looking for a home?
Unfortunately, one thing I haven't talked about in detail is how we investigate illegal housing discrimination. Because we have that enforcement part under our mission, we can't make recommendations directly for housing providers because we investigate housing providers to make sure of whether they're discriminating or not.
I
So
guess I should rephrase that. What
Okay.
I'm not to say is, say somebody like me is interested in purchasing a home as a disabled individual. I have natural barriers in place. Do you have like a, you know, programs or whatever out there that would be like a mentor or something like that that kind of help you navigate through the process?
I think we don't have that type of programming
Okay.
specifically where we can help one-on-one. But what we can do is educate anybody who's looking for housing.
Okay.
Or if you encounter an issue, let's say you want to visit, there are 3 specific cases that I can think of before the pandemic where a housing provider, these were rental situations, where literally the representative of the housing told the home seekers who all used wheelchairs, they said something along the lines of, well, I didn't know you were in a wheelchair when you called. I don't want to deal with that. You know, if that's the situation that's encountered, we can quickly get involved to let people know the law doesn't allow for that. And it depends on what the person wants. If you've been told, I don't want to deal with you, you may not want to deal with that landlord either. That's up to you. However, in this housing market, you may want to pursue that housing, and we could help advocate to make sure that you were able to tour that property or, you know, pursue that housing opportunity. So unfortunately, we're pretty limited that until something happens like that, that's our expertise. That's where we can get involved. But it just that kind of that general one-on-one help, we don't have enough people to do that.
Okay. Okay. For our next question, why can my request be denied?
This is a big question. What's unreasonable? Well, that depends. There are a couple of parameters or standards that HUD says this is how a housing provider would say this request is unreasonable. It's a fundamental alteration of the housing provider's business. So an example of that would be a private housing provider rents a unit to somebody who uses a wheelchair most of the time. He contacts the office and he says, I'm really happy. He's in a barrier-free unit. This is going really well. All I need for someone to do from this office is to take me to the grocery store once a week. That housing provider is only providing housing. They don't do any transportation or services or anything beyond just offering housing. Taking him to the grocery store would be a fundamental alteration of their business model. It's not what they do. They don't have transportation set up. They're not insured to transport their residents. It's unreasonable for him to ask for that. That's one example. So there's one other way that a request can be determined to be unreasonable. And I want to be sure to explain that. So the first one is we have fundamental alteration of the business. The second standard is that it's a administrative and financial burden on the housing provider. So this is an extreme example, but I think it illustrates the point. Maybe there's a fourplex, 4 units for rent in a small building, and somebody says, I'd like for you, landlord, to install an elevator in this building. And, that cost is going to be about $70,000. If it's, a small landlord, they don't have those resources. They can't put that type of investment into that property. It would be unreasonable because of the cost and the burden on that housing provider to do something like that. So those also leave a lot of wiggle room and gray area. And again, that's why each of these requests should be evaluated on a case-by-case basis. And then really quickly, before we move on probably to our last question, if a housing provider has done their homework and decided this is unreasonable for my tenant with a disability, the conversation does not stop there. I want to reiterate that. The obligation is to offer alternative accommodations or modifications. So keep the ball rolling, the conversation going to see, okay, we tried this, it doesn't work. What else can we do? Up until being released from the lease, penalty-free, because the housing simply doesn't work for that person with their disability and their disability-related needs anymore. That's kind of like the final step. Hopefully there's something that can be done. But sometimes people's conditions have changed so much that the housing simply is not a good fit anymore. And that's no one's fault. So there's opportunities beyond just the first ask.
How does assistance animal relate to fair housing? And if I may say, I do have a video as well with Pause for a Cause.
Oh, yes.
So nothing like a shameless plug. Go ahead.
We have certainly partnered with Pause for a Cause for education as well. So assistance animals under fair housing are broader than, I think if you hear Pause for a Cause, people think of a dog wearing a vest, which is very accurate. They train service dogs. So for me, I like to differentiate the two. A service dog that can go out in public to the movie theater, to restaurants, that's allowed under the Americans with Disabilities Act, or ADA. And they're also, of course, allowed in housing under the Fair Housing Act. But I think of it as the dog has been trained and really the person has been trained. So they work with each other very closely, those service dogs and their handlers. Under the Fair Housing Act, there's a broader definition of assistance animals. They can be any type of small domesticated animal, cats, dogs, birds, some types like turtles. There's a list from HUD that says if it's basically a small domesticated animal that has traditionally been kept in a home, they should be allowed as assistance animals. So it's bigger than just a trained service dog. So you can have cats that provide emotional support, or a bird that provides emotional support. They also might be trained and actually do some specific tasks but the housing definition allows for more types of animal and more types of support than specifically paws dogs. Paws dogs are allowed in housing and can go out in public. Assistance animals under fair housing are really about having your animal with you in your housing at home. Does that clarify the difference?
That is wonderful, because in my own mind, I was trying to interchange assistance and service.
Yes.
So I'm glad you distinguished the difference.
I really want to be very clear because there's so much information about the value of animals bringing to the lives of people with disabilities. So we want to really be clear about what the law can allow. And assistance animals in housing, there's new guidance from HUD that came out in January of 2020, right before the pandemic started, about 6 weeks before the pandemic started. So a lot of people missed that, understandably so, with everything that was going on in the world. So we have a whole resource guide. We have sample letters that help request assistance animals in housing. We also, on the flip side, have policies that landlords can adopt that talk about how an assistance animal needs to behave or be cared for in the housing. I mean, we really want to set this up to be successful, again, for both parties. So this is something that we have spent a lot of time on and are very willing to help either the landlord or the resident or applicant or tenant pursue their rights. So there's lots on our website that talks about that.
And lastly, this is kind of circles back to where we started. My last question was, those of us that are not in the West Michigan area where they could go to look for information about fair housing.
It's nationalfairhousing.org, and you can find a map of the United States and all the fair housing centers in their About section.
Okay. Okay. Well, thank you very much for coming today. It was very interesting, and I hope people can use it as a resource, if they're looking for housing as well. They could use this resource in their current living situation, correct?
Absolutely. We can help people, especially in accommodations and modifications. That's usually after they've moved in. But sometimes it's when you tour a property and you see, oh, that's going to need to change for me to live here. So yes, we help with access, and there's quite a few situations where we can help after someone has moved in.